They laughed when the single Dad Janitor was asked to fight 8 elite Navy SEALs just for practice. No one expected him to say yes. No one knew who he really was. But what he did next left the Admiral in complete silence. This isn't just a story about fighting. It's about dignity, redemption, and discovering that sometimes the greatest warriors hide behind the most ordinary masks. It's about a man who lost everything, disappeared into anonymity, and found himself again through the most unlikely challenge. If you believe in second chances, hidden strength, and the power of quiet determination to change everything, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We share stories that move hearts, inspire souls, and remind us that extraordinary people walk among us every day, often invisible until the moment they choose to be seen. What happened in that training facility that day would become legend. But the real story is about so much more than combat. It's about a father, a secret, and the moment when silence finally found its voice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like mechanical wasps as Kian Stone pushed his mop across the polished floors of Iron Harbor Naval Training Center. Each stroke was deliberate, methodical, almost meditative in its precision. The water swirled in patterns that reminded him of ocean currents, though the closest he got to the sea these days was through the reinforced windows of the facility where America's finest warriors learned their craft. At 34, Kian carried himself with a quiet dignity that most people mistook for resignation. His shoulders, though broader than seemed necessary for a janitor, had learned to hunch slightly under the weight of invisibility. His hands, calloused and strong, gripped a mop handle with the same careful control he applied to everything in his carefully constructed small life. The morning shift at Iron Harbor began at 5 a.m., 2 hours before the first Navy SEALs would thunder through the corridors in their perfectly synchronized formations. Kian preferred these quiet hours when the only sounds were the mechanical whispers of the building coming to life, and the soft splash of his mop bucket wheels rolling across the spotless floors. He moved through the training facilities like a ghost, cleaning the weight rooms where men pushed their bodies beyond human limits, sanitizing the classrooms where tactical strategies were dissected with surgical precision, and mopping the sparring mats, where future legends learned to turn their bodies into weapons. Every surface gleamed under his attention, every corner free of dust, every piece of equipment positioned exactly where it belonged. Most people who worked at Iron Harbor barely noticed him. To the administrative staff rushing past with their coffee cups and clipboards, he was simply part of the building's infrastructure, as essential and invisible as the ventilation system. To the instructors barking orders in the distance, he was a maintenance necessity, someone who appeared and disappeared without disrupting the serious business of forging warriors. But occasionally, someone would look twice. There was something in the way Kian moved that caught the eye of those trained to notice such things. His footsteps were too quiet for his size, his balance too perfect for someone who supposedly spent his days pushing cleaning equipment. When he bent to retrieve dropped papers or moved around obstacles, there was a fluid economy of motion that spoke of training far beyond janitorial work. His forearms, visible when he rolled up his sleeves during the warmer months, bore faded scars that told stories he never shared. A thin line across his left wrist, a crescent-shaped mark near his elbow, and knuckles that had clearly met resistance more than once. But Kian had learned to keep his sleeves down and his stories to himself. The locker room was his final stop each morning before the facility came alive with activity. As he cleaned the mirrors and swept the floors, he could hear the distant sound of vehicles arriving in the parking lot, doors slamming, voices carrying the particular cadence of military discipline. Soon, the peaceful sanctuary of his early morning routine would give way to the controlled chaos of elite training. He finished just as the first group of SEALs jogged past the locker room entrance, their synchronized footfalls echoing like a drumline. Through the doorway, he caught glimpses of men who moved with the lethal grace of apex predators, each one representing years of selection, training, and dedication that few humans could endure. Kian gathered his cleaning supplies and wheeled his cart toward the storage closet that served as his base of operations. The small room smelled of disinfectant and floor wax, lined with shelves of supplies and equipment that enabled him to maintain the pristine standards expected at Iron Harbor. On one shelf sat a battered thermos containing coffee that had grown cold hours ago, beside a brown bag lunch that would sustain him through another day of purposeful invisibility. As he hung up his mop and organized his supplies for the next shift, Kian allowed himself a moment to stretch his back and shoulders. The movement revealed the coiled strength that he kept carefully hidden beneath his maintenance uniform, muscles that memory still trained even when the mind had chosen a different path. Outside his storage closet, Iron Harbor Naval Training Center was waking up in earnest now. Instructors shouted commands, equipment clanged, and the sound of organized chaos filled every corridor. But inside his small domain, Kian maintained the same careful quiet that had become his signature over the past 3 years. He checked his watch, a simple digital model that had replaced the expensive timepieces he once wore. 7:30 meant his morning shift was complete, and he had 4 hours before the afternoon cleaning rotation began. Time enough to pick up his 8-year-old daughter from school, help her with homework, and maybe steal a few minutes at the small park near their apartment where she could play while he sat on a bench and remembered what it felt like to be someone else entirely. The transformation from Kian the janitor to Kian the father happened the moment he stepped outside Iron Harbor's gates. His shoulders straightened, his smile became genuine, and the careful mask of invisibility fell away just enough to reveal glimpses of the man he had been before life taught him the value of disappearing. As he walked toward his aging Honda Civic, parked in the section reserved for support staff, Kian passed clusters of Navy SEALs heading toward the training facilities. They moved with the confident swagger of men who knew their worth, who wore their elite status like armor against a world that demanded their excellence. None of them looked twice at the janitor walking in the opposite direction. Why would they? He was just part of the background, another invisible worker who enabled their important mission while remaining carefully outside its circle of recognition. But if any of them had possessed the curiosity to truly observe, they might have noticed that the janitor's walk contained the same balanced readiness they spent years perfecting. They might have seen that his hands, though gentle when he later helped his daughter tie her shoes, carried the call-used evidence of violence learned and mastered. They might have wondered why a man who cleaned floors moved like someone who understood exactly how quickly those floors could become a battlefield, and how every step through space was both a tactical decision and a commitment to either conflict or peace. But they didn't wonder, because Kian Stone had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being overlooked, and until someone gave him a reason to be seen, he was content to remain exactly what he appeared to be. Nothing more than a single father doing an honest job, harboring no secrets more dangerous than the love he carried for a little girl who thought her daddy was already a hero. The weight room at Iron Harbor buzzed with the particular energy of elite warriors testing their limits against iron and steel. 8 Navy SEALs moved through their workout with the synchronized precision of a choreographed dance, each repetition building the physical foundation that would keep them alive in situations where weakness meant death. Kian entered the space wheeling his cleaning cart, timing his arrival for the brief window between training sessions when he could sanitize equipment and mop floors without interfering with the sacred ritual of preparation. The SEALs barely acknowledged his presence, their attention focused entirely on the business of forging their bodies into weapons. 245 on bench, and Torres here is whining about his shoulder, laughed Gideon Stone, a mountain of a man whose arms looked like they could bend steel girders. His voice carried the easy confidence of someone who had never met a physical challenge he couldn't dominate. "My shoulder's fine," replied Cameron Shaw, adjusting the weight plates with movements that spoke of years spent perfecting every detail of his physical preparation. "Just making sure I don't overtrain before next week's evaluation." Kian worked quietly around them, spraying down equipment and wiping surfaces with the same methodical attention he brought to every task. His movements were efficient and unobtrusive, designed to complete his job without disrupting the flow of training that these men depended on. "Speaking of evaluation," said Orion Reed, the squad's designated marksman whose steady hands could place bullets through target centers from distances that defied belief, "did you guys hear about the new assessment protocols Admiral Beckett wants to implement?" The mention of Admiral Caspian Beckett caused a subtle shift in the room's energy. Even among these elite operators, Beckett commanded a respect that bordered on reverence. A former SEAL himself, he had risen through the ranks by demanding excellence that pushed even the best beyond their perceived limitations. "Something about stress testing under unconventional scenarios," added Lucien Shaw, whose expertise in close-quarters combat had earned him a reputation that extended far beyond Iron Harbor's walls. "Apparently, we're going to face situations designed to reveal how we perform when our usual advantages are stripped away." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kian continued his work, but something in the conversation caused his movements to slow almost imperceptibly. His hands, steady on the cleaning cloth, showed no outward sign of the attention he was paying to every word. "Unconventional how?" asked Merrick Stone, the team's explosive ordnance specialist, whose calm demeanor masked an intimate understanding of controlled destruction. "Could be anything," replied Daniel Wild, whose background in psychological operations had taught him to read situations and people with unsettling accuracy. "Beckett's known for creating scenarios that force you to rely on pure skill rather than equipment or numbers." As they talked, their workout continued with the relentless intensity that separated them from ordinary soldiers. Each rep, each set, each moment of controlled breathing contributed to the physical and mental conditioning that would determine whether they returned home from missions that existed only in classified files. Kian finished cleaning the bench press station and moved to the squat rack area, where Tristan Shaw was loading plates that would challenge even his considerable strength. Shaw was perhaps the most naturally gifted athlete among them, possessing a combination of speed, power and coordination that coaches spent lifetimes trying to develop in ordinary people. "You know what I heard?" Shaw said, settling the barbell across his shoulders with practiced ease. "I heard Beckett's planning to bring in outside sparring partners, people with different fighting backgrounds to test our adaptability." "Outside partners?" Gideon raised an eyebrow as he spotted Shaw's descent into a squat that would have crushed most people. "Like who?" "Mixed martial artists, boxers, maybe some martial arts specialists." Shaw grunted through his repetition. "The idea is to face techniques and styles we haven't specifically trained against." Kian's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his cleaning rag. He had moved to a position where he could hear every word while maintaining the appearance of focusing solely on his janitorial duties. "That actually makes sense," said Cameron, beginning his own set of deadlifts with weight that bent the bar slightly under its load. "In the field we're not always fighting people who've been through the same training programs we have. Plus," added Orion, "it keeps us humble. Nothing worse than a SEAL who thinks he's unstoppable just because he's never faced anything outside his comfort zone." Their conversation continued as Kian worked his way around the weight room, their voices blending with the rhythmic clang of metal and the controlled breathing of extreme exertion. They talked about techniques they'd mastered, opponents they'd faced, and the constant pursuit of improvement that defined their existence. But beneath their confidence, Kian detected something else. These were men who had spent years believing themselves to be the pinnacle of human warrior development, and the prospect of facing unknown challenges clearly intrigued them even as it sparked a competitive fire that burned in everything they did. "I say bring it on," declared Lucien, finishing a set of pull-ups that he made look effortless, despite the additional weight strapped to his waist. "I've been looking forward to testing myself against some fresh competition." "Careful what you wish for," laughed Daniel. "Remember what happened to Rodriguez last month when he got overconfident during that training exercise with the Marines." The group chuckled at the memory of their teammates' humbling experience, but Kian noticed that their laughter carried an edge of genuine respect for the unpredictability that kept them sharp. As their workout session neared its end, the SEALs began the process of cleaning up after themselves with the same attention to detail they brought to everything else. They wiped down equipment, returned weights to their proper positions, and organized the space for the next group of warriors who would soon take their place. Kian had finished most of his cleaning tasks, but he continued to work slowly, his presence becoming so routine that the SEALs talked around him as if he were simply another piece of gymnasium equipment. "You know what would be really interesting," said Gideon, toweling sweat from his face as he prepared to leave. "If Beckett could find someone who actually posed a legitimate challenge, not just different techniques, but someone who could really push us." "Someone like who?" asked Tristan. "I don't know," Gideon replied, his voice carrying the easy arrogance of a man who had never been truly tested. "Someone who's actually dangerous, instead of just different." As the SEALs filed out of the weight room, their voices fading down the corridor, Kian continued his methodical cleaning. But something had changed in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands moved across the surfaces he was sanitizing. For 3 years, he had perfected the art of invisibility, content to let these warriors believe they represented the pinnacle of human fighting capability. He had found peace in anonymity, safety in being overlooked, and purpose in the simple routine of honest work that supported his daughter's future. But as their voices disappeared completely, leaving him alone with the lingering scent of sweat and steel, Kian allowed himself a moment of remembering, a flash of who he had been before life taught him that some victories cost more than any defeat ever could. He finished his work and wheeled his cart toward the storage closet, his footsteps echoing in the empty weight room with a rhythm that suggested more than just the shuffle of a tired janitor heading home. Admiral Caspian Beckett stood at the observation deck overlooking Iron Harbor's primary training facility, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he watched 8 of his finest SEALs run through close-quarters combat drills. Each movement was precise, calculated, lethal in its efficiency. These men represented the culmination of decades of military evolution, the sharpest edge of America's sword. Yet something nagged at him. "Gentlemen," his voice cut through the training session like a blade through silk, causing every SEAL to freeze in perfect attention. "Gather around." The 8 operators moved with liquid grace to form a semicircle before their commanding officer. Gideon Stone, Cameron Shaw, Orion Reed, Lucian Shaw, Merrick Stone, Daniel Wild, Tristan Shaw, and Cedric Vance, each a master of warfare, each carrying the quiet confidence of men who had faced death and emerged victorious more times than they cared to count. "I've been watching your performance metrics," Beckett began, his steel-gray eyes scanning each face with the intensity of a man who had spent his life reading warriors. "Technically perfect, tactically sound. By every measurable standard, you represent the pinnacle of military excellence." The SEALs remained silent, sensing the weight of something unspoken in their admiral's words. But Beckett continued, "I'm concerned about complacency. You've become so proficient at fighting other SEALs, other military personnel, that you've developed blind spots, patterns, expectations." He began to pace, his words carrying the authority of a man who had earned his rank through blood and wisdom, rather than politics and paperwork. "Real enemies don't follow our playbook. They don't move the way we expect, don't respond to our techniques with the courtesy of textbook reactions. In the field you might face a former prizefighter, a martial artist, someone whose training comes from a completely different world than ours." Kian Stone was mopping the hallway just outside the training facility, close enough to hear every word through the open doorway. His movements had slowed to an almost imperceptible pace, his attention focused entirely on the conversation unfolding inside. "Sir," Gideon spoke up, his voice carrying the easy confidence that had never been truly tested. "With respect, we've trained against various fighting styles. Our hand-to-hand combat preparation includes techniques from multiple disciplines." Beckett's expression remained impassive. "Theoretical knowledge, Stone. Controlled exercises. When was the last time any of you faced an opponent who genuinely surprised you?"
Someone who forced you to adapt in real time rather than execute pre-planned responses. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Kian could sense the subtle shift in energy as 8 elite warriors grappled with the uncomfortable possibility that their admiral might be right. "I want to test that," Beckett announced. "I want to put you in a situation where your usual advantages, your teamwork, your familiar environment, are stripped away, where you have to rely purely on individual skill and adaptability." "What did you have in mind, sir?" asked Cameron Shaw. Beckett smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. "Individual combat assessment. Each of you one-on-one against opponents with unconventional backgrounds. No rules beyond basic safety protocols. No time limits. Just pure skill versus skill." The SEALs exchanged glances, and Kian could read the excitement building in their posture even from his position in the hallway. These were men who lived for challenges, who defined themselves through their ability to overcome impossible odds. "The question," Beckett continued, "is finding suitable opponents. It needs to be someone genuinely skilled, not just different, someone who can actually push you beyond your comfort zones." As if summoned by the Admiral's words, Alara Thorne appeared in the hallway, where Kian was working. Dr. Thorne served as the facility's chief medical officer, a position that required her to understand the physical and psychological demands placed on the warriors under her care. She was brilliant, compassionate, and possessed an uncanny ability to see through the masks that people wore to hide their true selves. "Excuse me," she said softly to Kian, who moved aside to let her pass. But instead of continuing toward the medical wing, she paused at the entrance to the training facility. "Admiral Beckett," she called out, her voice respectful but confident. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation." "Dr. Thorne," Beckett acknowledged with a nod. "Please, join us." Alara entered the training space, her presence immediately altering the dynamics of the room. The SEALs straightened slightly, not from military protocol but from the natural respect her competence commanded. "You're looking for unconventional sparring partners," she said, her intelligent eyes taking in the assembled warriors. "Someone skilled enough to genuinely challenge these gentlemen." "That's correct," Beckett replied. "Do you have suggestions?" Alara hesitated for a moment, then said something that would change everything. "There might be someone right here at the facility." 8 pairs of trained eyes focused on her with laser intensity, and in the hallway, Kian's hand tightened on his mop handle. "Here." Beckett raised an eyebrow. "Another instructor, someone from the support staff with military background." "Not military," Alara said carefully, "but someone with a background that might surprise you." She glanced toward the hallway where Kian stood frozen, and for a moment their eyes met. In that instant he realized that Dr. Alara Thorne saw far more than most people assumed. Her medical training had taught her to observe details that others missed, to notice the signs that revealed hidden truths about the human body, and the experiences that shaped it. "Who?" Beckett's question carried the weight of command. Alara looked back at the SEALs, then at their admiral, the janitor, Kian Stone. The training facility fell silent, except for the hum of ventilation systems, and the distant sounds of the naval base, continuing its daily operations. 8 elite warriors processed this information with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed amusement. "The janitor," Gideon Stone repeated, his voice carrying the disbelief of a man being told that his morning coffee was actually rocket fuel. "Dr. Thorne," Beckett said slowly, "I assume you have reason for this suggestion." "I've observed him for months," Alara replied, her voice growing stronger as she committed to this pass. "His movement patterns, the way he carries himself, certain physical indicators that suggest extensive combat training. I believe there's more to Mr. Stone than meets the eye." In the hallway, Kian felt the walls of his carefully constructed anonymity beginning to crumble. 3 years of invisibility, of safety, of peace, threatened to collapse under the weight of one woman's perception. "Interesting," Beckett mused, And you think he could provide the kind of challenge I'm looking for? I think, Alara said, choosing her words with surgical precision, that assumptions about people's capabilities based on their current occupation can be dangerously misleading. Cameron Shaw laughed, not with cruelty, but with the kind of disbelief that comes from a lifetime of measuring oneself against the world's finest. Doc, with all due respect, we're talking about Navy SEALs here. Elite special operations. Even if the guy has some martial arts background, it's not exactly the same league. Perhaps, Alara replied. But wouldn't that make it an even more valuable test? If your confidence is justified, then you have nothing to lose. And if it's not, then we learn something important. Beckett finished, his strategic mind already calculating the possibilities. The Admiral turned to face his SEALs directly. Gentlemen, Dr. Thorne has presented us with an interesting opportunity. A chance to test ourselves against a completely unknown variable. Sir, Tristan Shaw spoke up, you're seriously considering having us spar with the janitor. I'm considering having you face an opponent, about whom you know nothing, whose capabilities you can't predict, whose techniques you haven't studied. Beckett corrected, isn't that exactly the kind of challenge you need? The 8 SEALs stood in silence, processing the implications of what their Admiral was suggesting. These were men who had spent years proving themselves against the world's finest, and the idea of facing someone so far outside their usual sphere of competition was both intriguing and slightly insulting. Of course, Beckett added with a slight smile, if you're not confident in your abilities, we're confident, Gideon interrupted, his pride refusing to allow any doubt about their capabilities. If you want us to demonstrate the difference between elite military training and whatever background this guy might have, we're happy to provide that education. Excellent, Beckett said. Dr. Thorne, would you be willing to extend the invitation to Mr. Stone? Alara nodded, though Kian could see something in her expression that suggested she understood the magnitude of what she had just set in motion. As the meeting began to disperse, and the SEALs returned to their training with renewed energy and anticipation, Alara walked toward the hallway where Kian still stood, his cleaning supplies forgotten, his entire world balanced on the edge of a decision he wasn't ready to make. The catalyst had been introduced, the challenge had been issued, and somewhere deep in the heart of Iron Harbor Naval Training Center, the quiet janitor named Kian Stone faced a moment when invisibility would no longer be an option. Alara Thorne found Kian Stone exactly where she expected him to be, standing in the hallway with his mop frozen in his hands, and the look of a man watching his carefully constructed world begin to unravel. The late afternoon sun slanted through the high windows of Iron Harbor, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the weight of the moment stretching between them. Mr. Stone, she said quietly, approaching him with the same careful precision she used when dealing with wounded warriors who weren't ready to admit they needed help. Kian turned to face her, and for the first time since she had begun observing him, his mask of careful anonymity had slipped. His eyes held a depth of understanding that confirmed every suspicion she had harbored about the man who cleaned floors while moving like someone trained to end lives. Dr. Thorne, he replied, his voice steady, despite the circumstances. I heard what you told the Admiral. I'm sure you did. Alara stepped closer, close enough to speak without being overheard by anyone who might pass through the corridor. The question is, am I right about you? Kian set down his mop and leaned against the handle, a gesture that might have looked casual to an observer, but which Alara recognized as a man buying himself time to think. 3 years of questions he had successfully avoided were now focused into this single moment of decision. Why? He asked simply. Because those men in there are the best at what they do, and they know it, Alara replied. That confidence has kept them alive through missions that would break ordinary people. But it's also made them believe they're untouchable, unbeatable. And you think they're wrong. Alara studied his face, taking in the subtle signs that had first caught her The way his eyes tracked movement in his peripheral vision, the unconscious balance that suggested a body trained to react to threats. The call used knuckles that spoke of impact against harder surfaces than mop handles. I think, she said carefully, that they've never been truly tested by someone who learned to fight in a different world than theirs. Someone who didn't follow their rules or share their limitations. Kian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window where he could see Navy personnel moving with the purposeful efficiency that defined life at Iron Harbor. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested experiences far beyond janitorial work. Dr. Thorne, what makes you think I'm anything more than what you see? Instead of answering directly, Alara reached into the pocket of her medical coat and withdrew a tablet. A few quick taps brought up a medical file that she turned toward him. 3 years ago, when you started working here, you had to undergo a standard physical examination, she said. I've reviewed those records. Kian's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly.
Bone density, consistent with repetitive impact training. Alara continued, reading from the file. Scar tissue patterns on your hands and forearms, indicative of extended combat sports participation. Flexibility, and joint mobility, that suggests years of dedicated physical conditioning. Cardiovascular efficiency, that places you in the top percentile for your age group. She closed the tablet, and looked at him directly. Your medical profile reads like that of a professional athlete, not a maintenance worker. Athletes get old, Kian replied. They get injured. They retire. Some do, Alara agreed. But they don't usually disappear completely. They don't usually take jobs that require them to become invisible. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor. Admiral Beckett approached with the measured stride of a man accustomed to having important decisions rest on his shoulders. Behind him walked Gideon Stone, his expression carrying the anticipation of someone looking forward to an easy demonstration of superiority. Mr. Stone, Admiral Beckett said, his voice carrying the authority that came from decades of command. Dr. Thorne has made an interesting suggestion regarding tomorrow's training exercise. Kian straightened slightly, his hands moving to a more neutral position. The careful deference he showed to authority was genuine, but Alara noticed that his posture suggested readiness rather than submission. Admiral, Kian replied, respectfully. She believes you might be able to provide valuable training assistance to my SEALs. Beckett continued. Specifically, that you might serve as an effective sparring partner for combat assessment. Sir, I appreciate Dr. Thorne's confidence, but I'm not qualified for that kind of responsibility. Gideon Stone stepped forward, his massive frame and confident bearing emphasizing the contrast between elite warrior and maintenance worker. Admiral, with respect, this seems like a waste of everyone's time. If you want us to spar with civilians, we could contact local martial arts schools, maybe find some actual competitors. Mr. Stone, Beckett addressed Kian directly, ignoring his SEAL's interruption. Dr. Thorne seems to believe you have relevant experience. Would you care to elaborate? The moment stretched taut with possibility. Kian could deflect, make excuses, maintain the safety of anonymity that had protected him for 3 years. He could continue being the invisible man who cleaned floors and went home to help his daughter with homework and pretend that his past belonged to someone else entirely. But then Gideon Stone made a mistake. Look, the SEAL said. His voice carried the casual dismissiveness of someone who had never been forced to question his own superiority. I'm sure the guy's a decent enough janitor, but let's be realistic here. We train with the best operators in the world. We're not going to learn anything useful from someone who mops floors for a living. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Alara watched as something fundamental shifted in Kian's expression. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of recognition that some lines once crossed required a response. Gideon, Admiral Beckett's voice carried a warning that his subordinate was wise enough to recognize. Sorry, sir, Gideon replied. though his posture suggested he wasn't sorry about the sentiment, only about expressing it so directly. Kian looked at the Admiral, then at Dr. Thorne, and finally at Gideon Stone. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet certainty that changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. "I'll do it." "Excellent," Beckett replied, though Alara noticed he was studying Kian with renewed interest. "Tomorrow morning, 0800 hours. Training Facility A. Standard safety protocols, but otherwise unrestricted engagement." "How many?" Kian asked, and there was something in the question that made Alara's pulse quicken. "How many? What?" Beckett replied. "How many of your SEALs do you want me to spar with?" Gideon laughed, a sound that carried genuine amusement at what he perceived as the janitor's naivety. "Dude, you realize we're talking about one-on-one here, right? You versus one of us. And that's probably being generous." Kian's gaze moved to meet Gideon's directly, and for a moment the larger man's laughter faltered. There was something in the janitor's eyes that didn't match the humble exterior, something that suggested depths of experience that uniform and mop bucket couldn't conceal. "I understand," Kian said quietly. "One-on-one. Actually." Admiral Beckett interrupted, his strategic mind already working through possibilities. "Dr. Thorne's original suggestion was that you could provide training value to the entire team. Perhaps we should think bigger." "Sir," Gideon's confidence wavered slightly. "All 8, Beckett decided, his voice carrying the finality of command. "Sequential sparring, Mr. Stone versus each member of the team. If he's as capable as Dr. Thorne suggests, they'll all benefit from the experience. If not, the exercise will be concluded quickly." Alara saw Kian's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. 8 SEALs, one after another. "Is that a problem?" Gideon asked, his earlier amusement returning at what seemed like an impossibly lopsided challenge. "No," Kian replied, and something in the simple word made Alara realize that she had just witnessed the moment when a man decided to stop hiding from who he really was. "No problem at all." As Admiral Beckett and Gideon Stone walked away, discussing logistics and safety protocols, Alara remained with Kian in the hallway. The late afternoon shadows had grown longer, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sounds of the day shift ending and evening routines beginning. "You know what you just agreed to?" she asked quietly. Kian picked up his mop, but his movements had changed. The careful humility was still there, but underneath it was something else, something that suggested the janitor was beginning to remember what it felt like to be someone else entirely. "I know," he said, "but some things can't be taken back once they're said." The comment about mopping floors, the assumption that what someone does defines what they're capable of. Kian began moving down the hallway, his cleaning duties calling despite the magnitude of what tomorrow would bring. Some people forget that everyone has a story. Everyone came from somewhere. Alara watched him walk away, noting that his stride had changed subtly, still quiet, still controlled, but no longer quite so invisible. "Kian," she called after him. He turned back, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked like someone who was no longer carrying the full weight of secrets. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For seeing me," he replied, "even when I was trying not to be seen." As he disappeared around the corner, Alara realized that she had just set in motion events that would change everything at Iron Harbor Naval Training Center. Tomorrow, 8 of America's finest warriors would face an opponent they couldn't categorize, couldn't predict, couldn't prepare for using any of their usual methods. And somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of a man who had spent 3 years mopping floors beginning to remember what it felt like to be dangerous. The evening air at Millfield Elementary School carried the familiar chaos of dismissal time. Yellow buses rumbling to life, teachers herding stragglers toward waiting cars, and the high-pitched conversations of young people whose biggest concerns involved homework and playground politics. Kian Stone sat in his aging Honda Civic, watching through the chain-link fence as 8-year-old Sophia navigated the social dynamics of 3rd grade with the same careful observation he applied to everything else in his life. She was beautiful in the way that reminded him daily of everything he had lost, and everything he still had to protect. Dark hair that caught the sunlight like her mother's had. Eyes that held curiosity about a world she trusted to be fundamentally good, and a smile that could transform his worst days into something bearable. "Daddy," she called out, breaking into a run that carried her across the playground and through the gate where parents waited in cars and on foot. Her backpack bounced against her small frame, stuffed with the accumulated treasures of a school day, worksheets, art projects, and the endless collection of smooth rocks that she insisted on bringing home. "Hey sweetheart," Kian said, stepping out to help her with the car door and the complex engineering project of getting an 8-year-old properly secured in her booster seat. "How was school, Mrs. Patterson says? I'm getting really good at multiplication," Sophia announced with the pride of someone who had just conquered Mount Everest. "And I got to feed the class hamster because Jimmy Morrison was absent." As they drove through the familiar streets that led home to their modest apartment complex, Sophia provided a detailed analysis of her day that touched on everything from the cafeteria's questionable pizza to the ongoing drama surrounding who got to be line leader during fire drills. Kian listened with the complete attention he had trained himself to give her, filing away details that would help him understand her world and the small triumphs and defeats that shaped her experience. Their apartment was a testament to careful budgeting and priorities chosen with mathematical precision. The furniture was second-hand but well-maintained, the walls decorated with Sophia's artwork and a few carefully selected photographs that showed their life together without revealing too much about the life that had come before. The kitchen was small but functional, the living room arranged to maximize space for homework and the elaborate floor-based construction projects that occupied much of Sophia's free time. "Can I watch cartoons while you make dinner?" Sophia asked, already settling onto the couch with the practiced efficiency of a routine they had perfected over years of just the two of them. "Homework first," Kian replied, the same gentle firmness he applied to everything involving her education and development. "Then cartoons while I cook." As Sophia spread her books across the coffee table, Kian moved through the familiar ritual of afternoon snack preparation and homework supervision. He checked her math worksheets with the same attention to detail he brought to cleaning floors at Iron Harbor, caught spelling mistakes with the patience of someone who understood that learning required both challenge and encouragement. But tonight his mind kept drifting to tomorrow morning, and the 8 Navy SEALs who expected to demonstrate their superiority over a janitor who had agreed to something that would change everything. "Daddy, you're being quiet," Sophia observed, looking up from a worksheet about fractions with the perceptiveness that sometimes startled him. "Just thinking about work, sweetheart," Kian replied, settling beside her to help with a particularly challenging problem. "Do you like your job?" she asked, the question carrying more weight than she probably intended. Kian paused, considering how to answer honestly without burdening her with complexities she wasn't ready to understand. "I like that it lets me take care of you," he said finally. "And I like that the people I work with do important things." "What kind of important things?" "They protect people," Kian said. "They train to keep our country safe." Sophia nodded with the seriousness she brought to concepts that stretched beyond her immediate experience. "Like superheroes." "Something like that." They worked through homework together, the familiar routine providing comfort and structure that had become the foundation of their life together. When the worksheets were completed and checked, Sophia settled in front of the television while Kian prepared dinner with movements that had become automatic through years of single parenthood. But tonight, as he moved through the kitchen, his mind kept returning to the moment in the hallway when Dr. Alara Thorne had looked at him with eyes that saw past the carefully constructed facade he had maintained for 3 years. There had been something in her perception that reminded him of recognition, of being seen by someone who understood that appearances could be profoundly misleading. The knock at the door came just as he was setting plates on their small dining table.
Kian glanced through the peephole and felt his pulse quicken at the sight of Dr. Thorne standing in the hallway outside his apartment, holding what appeared to be a folder and wearing an expression that suggested this was not a casual social visit. "Sophia, stay here and finish your show," he said, opening the door with the caution of someone who had learned to be wary of unexpected visitors. "Mr. Stone," Dr. Thorne said, her voice carrying the same careful precision he had observed at the naval facility. "I hope I'm not intruding. I was hoping we could talk." "How did you find my address?" Kian asked, though he kept his voice low to avoid alarming Sophia. "Personnel records," Alara replied honestly. "I know it's presumptuous, but after this afternoon I realized there were things we should discuss before tomorrow." Kian glanced back at Sophia, who was absorbed in cartoons and unaware of the adult conversation taking place at the door. The apartment suddenly felt very small, very exposed, as if the careful boundaries he had built between his work life and home life were beginning to blur in ways that made him uncomfortable. "Can we talk outside?" he asked. Alara nodded, and they moved to the small balcony that overlooked the apartment complex's courtyard. The evening air was cool, and somewhere in the distance, Kian could hear the sounds of other families navigating their own routines, television programs, dinner conversations, and the occasional laughter of people whose lives hadn't been shaped by the kind of loss that taught you to be grateful for ordinary moments. "You have a daughter," Alara observed, and there was something in her voice that suggested she understood the weight that single parenthood added to every decision. "Sophia," Kian confirmed. "She's 8. She's beautiful. I caught a glimpse when you opened the door." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them understanding that this conversation was about more than tomorrow's training exercise. "Dr. Thorne," Kian began. "Alara," she corrected gently. "Alara, why did you really come here tonight?" She turned to face him directly, and in the fading light, he could see the intelligence and compassion that had made her such an effective physician. "Because I realized that I may have put you in an impossible position without understanding the full scope of what you have at stake." "What do you mean?" "You're not just a janitor who might have some fighting experience," she said. "You're a father who's built a life that depends on staying invisible. And I just took that invisibility away." Kian felt something in his chest tighten at her understanding. For 3 years he had successfully maintained the delicate balance between providing for Sophia and protecting the quiet stability that had allowed her to grow up without being shaped by his past. "Those SEALs tomorrow," Alara continued. "They're going to want to know who you really are, where you trained, how you learned to fight. And once those questions start, anonymity becomes very difficult to maintain." "I know," Kian said quietly. "But you agreed anyway." He looked back toward the apartment where Sophia was watching cartoons, trusting that her father would handle whatever adult complications arose without disrupting the safe world he had created for her. "Some things can't be ignored once they're said," he replied, echoing his earlier words. "And some people need to be reminded that respect isn't something you're entitled to just because of what you wear to work." Alara studied his profile as he watched his daughter through the sliding glass door. "She doesn't know, does she, about who you used to be?" "She knows I love her," Kian said. "She knows I'll take care of her. Everything else is just history. History has a way of catching up with people. I know that too." They stood quietly for another moment, both of them understanding that tomorrow would change everything regardless of what happened in the training facility. "Kian," Alara said softly, "can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. Are you ready for this, really ready?" He turned to look at her, and for the first time since she had known him, his expression held no trace of the careful humility he usually wore like armor. "Dr. Thorne, Alara, I've been ready for 3 years, he said. "I just haven't had a reason to stop hiding. And now you do." Kian glanced back at Sophia, then at the woman whose perception had started the chain of events that would either restore or destroy the careful peace he had built. "Now I do," he confirmed. As Alara prepared to leave, she handed him the folder she had been carrying. "Medical clearance for tomorrow's exercise," she explained. And my personal assessment that you're physically and mentally prepared for whatever happens. Thank you, Kian said, accepting the folder with hands that had finally stopped trying to hide their true nature. Kian, she called as she reached the top of the stairs leading down to the parking lot. Yes, for what it's worth, I think Sophia is lucky to have a father who's willing to fight for what matters. After she left, Kian returned to the apartment where his daughter was waiting with questions about who had visited and whether everything was okay. He assured her that it was just a colleague from work, helped her get ready for bed, and read her a story about brave princesses and hidden kingdoms, where heroes sometimes had to pretend to be ordinary people, until the moment came to reveal their true selves. As she drifted off to sleep, Kian sat in the small living room and allowed himself to remember what it felt like to be someone other than the invisible man who cleaned floors. Tomorrow, 8 Navy SEALs would learn that assumptions about capability could be dangerously misleading. But tonight, he was simply a father who had promised his daughter that tomorrow would be another ordinary day, even though he knew it would be anything but ordinary for the man she trusted to keep her world safe and stable. The pre-dawn hours at Iron Harbor Naval Training Center held a different quality of silence than any other time of day. It was the deep quiet that came before warriors began their daily ritual of pushing human capability beyond its natural limits, a stillness that allowed a man to think clearly about choices that could not be undone. Kian Stone sat alone in the facility's small chapel, a non-denominational space designed to provide solace to people whose profession required them to confront mortality on a regular basis. The wooden pews were simple, functional, and had absorbed the prayers and fears of countless service members who understood that preparation for battle required more than just physical conditioning. He wasn't praying, exactly. Prayer suggested a belief in intervention, in the possibility that divine forces might alter the course of events based on human appeals. Instead, Kian was remembering, allowing himself to revisit the parts of his past that he had spent 3 years trying to forget. The sound of soft footsteps caused him to turn. Dr. Alara Thorne entered the chapel with the careful movements of someone who understood the sacred nature of solitude, and didn't want to intrude upon whatever process was taking place in the mind of the man who would soon face 8 of America's finest warriors. "I thought I might find you here," she said quietly, settling into the pew beside him with enough distance to respect his space while close enough to provide companionship if he wanted it. "Couldn't sleep," Kian replied, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had spent the night wrestling with memories that refused to stay buried. "Second thoughts? No, just making sure I remember why I stopped fighting in the first place." Alara studied his profile in the dim light that filtered through the chapel's simple stained glass windows. There was something different about him this morning, a subtle transformation that suggested the careful anonymity he had maintained for 3 years was beginning to fall away like an outgrown skin. "Would you tell me," she asked gently, "about before?" Kian was quiet for so long that Alara wondered if he had decided not to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the distant quality of someone accessing memories that had been locked away for safekeeping. "I was someone else entirely," he began. "Someone who believed that strength was the answer to every problem, that technique and conditioning could overcome any obstacle." He paused, and Alara waited with the patience she had learned from years of working with people whose wounds weren't always visible. "Mixed martial arts," Kian continued. "Professional level. I spent 12 years climbing through every organization that mattered, collecting championships and building a reputation that opened doors I thought I wanted to walk through." The revelation hit Alara with the force of recognition. She had suspected military background, maybe law enforcement, but professional fighting explained everything she had observed about his movement patterns and physical conditioning. "What name did you fight under?" she asked, though something in her tone suggested she might already know the answer. "Kai Silent Storm Chen," Kian replied, using a name he hadn't spoken aloud in 3 years. Alara's breath caught. Even someone with only casual interest in combat sports would recognize that name. Kai Chen had been a legend in mixed martial arts, a fighter whose combination of technique, power, and psychological warfare had dominated multiple weight classes for nearly a decade. "You were undefeated," she whispered. "For 11 years and 47 fights," Kian confirmed. "I had everything. Championship belts, endorsement deals, a training facility that attracted fighters from around the world. I was at the top of a mountain that took me half my life to climb." "What happened?" The question hung between them like a bridge that Kian would either cross or burn. When he finally answered, his voice carried the kind of pain that time could diminish but never completely heal. "I met Sarah at a charity event," he said. "She was a pediatric nurse, someone who spent her days helping people instead of hurting them. She looked at me like I was more than just a collection of victories and defeats." Alara felt her chest tighten as she began to understand where this story was leading. "We married 2 years later," Kian continued. "Had Sophia the year after that. For the first time in my adult life I had something more important than winning. But you kept fighting." "I kept fighting." Sarah understood that it was who I was, how I provided for our family. She never asked me to choose between fighting and being a husband and father. She just asked me to be careful. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of choices that could never be unmade. "The accident happened on a Tuesday," Kian said, his voice becoming even quieter. "I was in training camp for what was supposed to be the biggest fight of my career. Pay-per-view main event, more money than I'd ever made in a single night." Alara found herself holding her breath, understanding that she was about to hear the truth that had transformed a champion into a janitor. Sarah was driving Sophia to daycare before heading to her shift at the hospital. Kian continued. "It was raining and visibility was poor. A delivery truck ran a red light going 45 miles per hour. The words fell between them like stones dropping into still water, each one creating ripples that would never completely fade. Sarah died instantly," Kian said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was sharing. "Sophia survived because Sarah managed to turn the car at the last second, taking the full impact on the driver's side." Alara reached out instinctively, placing her hand gently on his arm in a gesture of comfort that felt both necessary and insufficient. "I was hitting pads when it happened," Kian continued, "perfecting combinations that were supposed to win me another championship. While my wife was dying and my daughter was being pulled from the wreckage, I was worried about whether my left hook was setting up my right cross properly." "Kian, you couldn't have known." "That's what everyone said. The doctors, the lawyers, the grief counselors, everyone who tried to help me understand that I wasn't responsible for a drunk driver who ran a red light in the rain. But you didn't believe them." "I believed that I had spent so much time preparing to hurt people that I forgot to be present for the people who mattered most. I believed that all my training, all my strength, all my capability was worthless when it came to protecting the only things that actually gave my life meaning." Kian turned to look at Alara directly for the first time since he had begun telling his story. In his eyes she could see the grief that had never fully healed, but also something else, something that suggested transformation rather than just destruction. "I walked away from everything after the funeral," he said. "Broke contracts, forfeited title shots, closed the gym. I took Sophia and disappeared because I couldn't stand the idea of being celebrated for violence when violence had taken everything from me. And you became a janitor. I became invisible, anonymous, someone who cleaned up after other people instead of destroying things for entertainment." Alara processed this information while trying to reconcile the champion fighter with the quiet man who had spent 3 years mopping floors with such careful attention to detail. "But you're still a father," she said softly. "I'm still a father," Kian agreed. "And Sophia needed me to be present, to be stable, to be someone she could count on. The fighting was never about her. It was always about me, about my ego, about proving something that turned out not to matter." "So why are you doing this today?" Why face those SEALs? Kian was quiet for a moment, considering the question that went to the heart of everything he had struggled with since agreeing to Admiral Beckett's challenge. Because yesterday, for the first time in 3 years, someone looked at me like I was invisible, not by choice but by diminishment, he said. Because Sophia deserves to see that her father stands up for what's right even when it's difficult. And because you're tired of hiding. And because I'm tired of hiding, he confirmed. The chapel fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. The weight of secrets had been lifted, replaced by the clarity that came from truth finally spoken aloud. Kai Chen, Alara said, testing the name. The silent storm. That person doesn't exist anymore, Kian replied. He died in a car accident 3 years ago along with everything else that mattered to him. But the skills remain. The skills remain. And today, 8 Navy SEALs are going to learn that strength without humility is just violence waiting for an excuse. As they sat together in the growing light of dawn, Alara understood that she was witnessing something rare and profound. The transformation of a man who had lost everything and found something more valuable in the wreckage. Not the return of a champion, but the emergence of someone who had learned that true power came not from the ability to destroy but from the wisdom to know when destruction was necessary and when mercy was stronger. Kian, she said, as they prepared to leave the chapel. Yes, those SEALs don't know what they're walking into. He smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, the expression reached his eyes completely. The Iron Harbor Naval Training Center's primary combat facility had been transformed overnight into something resembling a gladiatorial arena. Portable bleachers had been assembled along 3 walls, medical equipment positioned at strategic intervals, and the central mat area expanded to accommodate what Admiral Caspian Beckett had announced would be an educational demonstration of adaptive combat principles. Word had spread through the base with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. By 0700 hours, an hour before the scheduled demonstration, every available seat had been claimed by personnel ranging from junior enlisted sailors eager for entertainment to senior officers whose curiosity had been piqued by rumors of an unprecedented challenge to their elite forces. The 8 Navy SEALs who would participate in the exercise moved through their pre-combat preparation with the methodical precision that had been drilled into them through years of training. Each man followed his own specific ritual: dynamic stretching, mental visualization, equipment checks, and the careful psychological preparation that separated professionals from amateurs.
Gideon Stone, the largest and most physically imposing of the group, worked through a series of grappling drills with Cameron Shaw, their movements flowing with the unconscious coordination of partners who had trained together long enough to anticipate each other's reactions. Both men carried the quiet confidence of warriors who had never been defeated in personal combat, whose understanding of their own capabilities had been forged through countless hours of preparation and validated through real-world application. "This is going to be embarrassing," Gideon muttered, as he adjusted his protective gear. "For him, I mean. Poor guy probably has no idea what he's gotten himself into." "Beckett must have a reason for setting this up," Cameron replied, though his tone suggested he shared his teammates' assessment. "Maybe it's some kind of psychological exercise, confidence building or something." Across the facility, Orion Reed and Lucian Shaw engaged in light sparring, their strikes controlled but precise as they warmed up the reflexes that could mean the difference between life and death in actual combat. Reed, whose marksmanship skills were legendary even among special operations forces, possessed a calm focus that extended to hand-to-hand combat, while Shaw's background in close-quarters battle had earned him a reputation as one of the most dangerous individual fighters in the SEAL community. "You guys hear anything about this janitor's background?" Reed asked between combinations. "Nothing concrete," Shaw replied. "Thorne seems to think he's got some kind of training, but you know how medical people are. They see everyone as more fragile than they actually are." The remaining team members, Merrick Stone, Daniel Wild, Tristan Shaw, and Cedric Vance, occupied different areas of the facility, each following his own preparation routine while keeping one eye on the growing crowd of spectators. The attention didn't bother them. Public demonstration was part of their responsibility as representatives of America's elite military capability. Admiral Beckett entered the facility at precisely 0730 hours, his presence immediately commanding the respect and attention of everyone present. He moved through the space with the measured stride of a leader who understood that every action was being observed and evaluated by subordinates who needed to see strength and certainty in their command structure. "Gentlemen," he addressed his SEALs, "I want to remind you that today's exercise is about adaptation and humility. You are facing an unknown opponent using unknown techniques. Your job is not to dominate but to learn." "Understood, sir," the 8 replied in unison, though their expressions suggested they viewed this more as a formality than a genuine warning. Alara Thorne appeared at the edge of the mat area, carrying a medical kit and wearing the expression of someone who understood the true scope of what was about to unfold. She had spent the early morning reviewing everything she could find about Kai Silent Storm Chen, and the depth of his accomplishments had both impressed and worried her. 47 professional fights, 47 victories, 13 different championship belts across multiple organizations, a fighting style that combined technical precision with psychological warfare so effective that opponents often defeated themselves before the actual combat began. But more than the statistics, what concerned Alara was the manner of his retirement. Champions in combat sports usually faded gradually, their skills diminishing with age and accumulating damage until younger fighters surpassed them. Kai Chen had simply vanished at the height of his abilities, walking away from millions of dollars and guaranteed fame for reasons that no one in the fighting community had ever fully understood. Now she knew, and as she watched the Navy SEALs prepare for what they assumed would be an easy demonstration of their superiority, she felt the weight of knowledge that she couldn't share without betraying Kian's trust. At 0755 hours, Kian Stone entered the facility through a side door, wearing simple gray sweatpants and a black t-shirt that emphasized rather than concealed the physical conditioning he had maintained despite 3 years away from professional competition. His appearance caused a ripple of attention through the assembled spectators, most of whom were seeing the facility's janitor in a context that transformed their perception of his role and capabilities. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far more intimidating environments than a military training facility filled with curious observers. The psychological pressure that might overwhelm an amateur seemed to have no effect on him whatsoever. If anything, the attention appeared to sharpen his focus rather than diminish it. Admiral Beckett approached him as he reached the edge of the mat area. "Stone," the Admiral said, "are you prepared for this exercise?" "Yes, sir," Kian replied, his voice carrying the same respectful tone he had always used with authority figures, though something in his posture suggested a subtle shift from deference to readiness. "The rules are simple," Beckett announced, raising his voice so that everyone in the facility could hear. "Individual combat, 3-minute rounds, standard safety protocols. Each of my SEALs will face Mr. Stone in sequence. The exercise continues until completion or until medical concerns require termination." He paused, scanning the faces of both his elite operators and the man who had agreed to face them all. "The purpose of this demonstration is educational. Every warrior benefits from facing unfamiliar challenges. Mr. Stone has generously agreed to provide that challenge." Kian stepped onto the mat and began a warm-up routine that immediately caught the attention of everyone present. His movements flowed with the fluid precision of someone whose body had been trained to respond instantly to mental commands, each stretch and rotation revealing the sophisticated understanding of human biomechanics that separated professionals from recreational athletes. The SEALs watched with growing interest as Kian demonstrated flexibility, balance and coordination that clearly exceeded anything they had expected from a maintenance worker. His warm-up included techniques from multiple martial arts disciplines, suggesting a background far more comprehensive than simple military hand-to-hand combat training. "Okay," Gideon Stone admitted quietly to his teammates, "maybe this won't be quite as embarrassing as I thought." "Still just a janitor," Cameron Shaw replied, though his tone suggested less certainty than his words conveyed. Dr. Thorne positioned herself near the medical station, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to avoid interfering with the actual combat. From her vantage point, she could observe both the SEAL's preparation and Kian's transformation as he mentally prepared for the first genuine combat he had experienced in 3 years. The change in him was subtle but unmistakable. The careful humility that had characterized his demeanor for so long was falling away, replaced by something that suggested coiled danger held in check by conscious choice rather than inability. His eyes scanned the facility with the systematic attention of someone evaluating potential threats and escape routes, a habit ingrained by years of professional fighting where awareness could mean the difference between victory and serious injury. At exactly 0800 errors, Admiral Beckett called for attention. "Gentlemen, we will begin with Petty Officer Vance," he announced, indicating Cedric Vance, the team's communications specialist whose compact build and quick reflexes made him an ideal choice to test their opponent's capabilities without immediately overwhelming him. Vance stepped onto the mat with the confident bearing of someone who had never lost a hand-to-hand combat engagement. His training included techniques from multiple martial arts, refined through years of application in both training and real-world scenarios. He was fast, technically proficient, and possessed the kind of tactical intelligence that allowed him to adapt quickly to unexpected situations. Kian moved to the center of the mat and extended his hand in the traditional gesture of respect that preceded formal combat. Vance accepted the handshake, noting that his opponent's grip carried the call-used strength of someone whose hands had been conditioned through extensive training. "Good luck," Vance said, the words carrying genuine sportsmanship despite his expectation of easy victory. "Thank you," Kian replied, and something in his voice caused Vance to look more carefully at the man he was about to face. Admiral Beckett raised his hand, prepared to signal the beginning of what everyone assumed would be a brief demonstration of the difference between elite military training and whatever amateur fighting experience a janitor might possess. "Begin," Beckett commanded, and in that instant, the quiet man who had spent 3 years cleaning floors at Iron Harbor Naval Training Center disappeared entirely, replaced by something that 8 of America's finest warriors were completely unprepared to face. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The moment Admiral Beckett's command echoed through the facility, key and stone ceased to exist, replaced by someone who moved with the fluid precision of water finding its way through stone. Cedric Vance, confident and prepared, launched forward with a textbook combination that had overwhelmed countless opponents in both training and combat. His strikes met empty air. Kian had shifted his position with such subtle economy of movement that Vance found himself attacking space that his opponent had vacated before the attack even began. It wasn't dramatic evasion. It was something far more unsettling. Perfect spatial awareness that allowed him to be exactly where danger was not. Vance adjusted instantly, his training kicking in as he pursued with a series of strikes designed to cut off escape routes and force engagement. But each attack met the same result. Kian moved like smoke, present but untouchable, always one step ahead of techniques that should have connected. The facility fell silent except for the sound of Vance's breathing and the soft whisper of feet moving across the mat. 200 spectators watched in growing amazement as one of their elite warriors became increasingly frustrated in his attempts to land a single clean strike. Then Kian moved. It happened so quickly that many observers missed the transition entirely. One moment he was evading, the next he was inside Vance's guard with his hand resting gently against the SEAL's throat. The touch was light, controlled, almost gentle, but its message was unmistakable. This could have been devastating. Vance froze, his eyes widening as he realized that he had been completely outmaneuvered by an opponent he couldn't even track, let alone counter. "Reset," Admiral Beckett called, his voice carrying a new note of interest. The two fighters separated and returned to neutral positions. Vance's confidence had been replaced by something far more dangerous: respect for an opponent whose capabilities he had completely misjudged. The second engagement lasted even less time. Vance came forward with increased caution,
but Kian flowed around his defenses like liquid mercury, ending the exchange with the seal on his back and a knee positioned precisely where it could have ended the fight permanently. "Enough," Beckett declared, and Vance tapped out with the wisdom of someone who recognized when he was outclassed. As Vance rose to his feet, slightly dazed but uninjured, he offered his hand to Kian with genuine respect. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Kian simply nodded and moved back to neutral position as Admiral Beckett called for the next opponent. Cameron Shaw stepped onto the mat with considerably more caution than his teammate had shown. Shaw was bigger, stronger, and possessed grappling skills that had dominated every opponent he had faced in his military career. But he had also just watched a fellow SEAL get systematically dismantled by someone who moved unlike anyone he had ever seen. The engagement began with Shaw attempting to use his size and strength advantages to control distance and dictate the pace of combat. His approach was sound, methodical, and based on years of successful application against world-class opponents. None of it mattered. Kian moved through Shaw's defenses like they were suggestions rather than barriers. His strikes, when they came, were precise to the point of surgical accuracy, targeting nerve clusters and pressure points with the kind of anatomical knowledge that suggested extensive study of human vulnerability. Shaw found himself on the receiving end of techniques he couldn't identify, executed with timing he couldn't anticipate, by someone who seemed to understand his capabilities better than he understood them himself. The end came when Kian applied what appeared to be a simple wrist control that somehow resulted in Shaw's complete immobilization. The SEAL tapped out immediately, recognizing that struggling would only result in serious injury. "Sir," Shaw said to Admiral Beckett as he left the mat, "this isn't what we expected." By the time Orion Reed stepped forward as the third opponent, the entire facility had fallen into the kind of focused silence that accompanied witnessing something unprecedented. Reed was perhaps the most technically precise fighter among the SEALs, his marksmanship skills translating into hand-to-hand combat that emphasized accuracy over power. His engagement with Kian lasted longer than the previous two, but only because Kian seemed to be studying Reed's techniques with the detached interest of someone analyzing a particularly interesting problem. When he chose to end the match, he did so with a combination that left Reed unconscious for exactly 3 seconds before Dr. Thorne intervened to ensure he was uninjured. Reed regained consciousness to find himself staring up at the ceiling, completely disoriented and unable to remember the sequence of events that had put him there. "What happened?" he asked as Alara helped him to a sitting position. "You met someone," she replied quietly, "who fights in a completely different language than anything you've learned." The fourth, fifth, and sixth opponents followed in quick succession. Lucien Shaw, despite his reputation for close-quarters supremacy, found himself systematically outmaneuvered and submitted through techniques that seemed to violate the fundamental principles of leverage and physics. Merrick Stone, whose explosive power had never failed to overwhelm opponents, discovered that power meant nothing when it couldn't connect with its target. Daniel Wild, the psychological operations specialist whose mental games had unsettled countless adversaries, found himself facing someone whose psychological warfare was so sophisticated that it operated on levels he couldn't even perceive, let alone counter. Each SEAL left the mat with the same expression of stunned disbelief, their confidence replaced by the humbling recognition that they had just encountered a level of fighting skill that existed entirely outside their understanding of what was possible. Tristan Shaw, the seventh opponent, was perhaps the most naturally gifted athlete among them. His combination of speed, power, and coordination had never been matched by anyone he had faced. He approached the mat with the determination of someone who refused to accept that any civilian could possess capabilities beyond those of America's elite warriors. His engagement with Kian became the longest of the demonstration, not because he was more successful than his teammates, but because Kian seemed genuinely interested in testing himself against such exceptional natural ability. For nearly 2 minutes, Shaw managed to avoid the submission attempts that had quickly ended the previous matches, his athletic gifts allowing him to escape situations that would have finished lesser opponents. But escape was not victory, and gradually Shaw began to understand that he was not fighting a man so much as he was fighting a force of nature that happened to be housed in human form. Kian's techniques flowed into each other with seamless precision, each movement setting up the next in combinations so sophisticated that Shaw couldn't identify where one technique ended and another began. The end came when Kian applied what wrestling analysts would later describe as a perfect standing kimura, executed with such control that Shaw's arm was immobilized completely without any risk of injury. The SEAL tapped out with the frustrated respect of someone who had given everything he had, and discovered it wasn't nearly enough. Gideon Stone was the final opponent, and by the time he stepped onto the mat, the entire character of the demonstration had changed. What had begun as expected entertainment had become something approaching a masterclass in combat technique that no one present was qualified to truly understand. Gideon was the largest, strongest, and most physically imposing of the SEALs. His confidence had been shaken by watching 7 teammates systematically defeated, but his warrior's pride refused to accept that anyone could possess such overwhelming superiority in personal combat. He approached Kian with the careful respect of someone who had learned to take nothing for granted, but also with the determination of someone who had never been truly beaten in a fair fight. The engagement that followed was unlike any of the previous matches. Gideon's size and strength forced Kian to work harder, to demonstrate techniques that required more obvious effort and commitment. For the first time in the demonstration, the crowd could clearly see the skill being applied rather than simply witnessing its effects. Kian moved around Gideon like a sculptor working with particularly challenging material, applying pressure here, redirecting force there, gradually wearing down his opponent's defenses through techniques that were beautiful in their complexity and terrifying in their effectiveness. The finish came when Kian executed what combat sports historians would later identify as a perfect application of leverage and timing that left Gideon Stone, all 240 pounds of elite warrior, unconscious on the mat for nearly 10 seconds. As Dr. Thorne attended to Gideon and confirmed that he was uninjured, Admiral Beckett stepped onto the mat where Kian stood alone, barely breathing hard despite having just faced 8 of America's finest fighters in succession. The facility was absolutely silent. 200 military personnel sat in stunned amazement, trying to process what they had just witnessed. "Mr. Stone," Admiral Beckett said, his voice carrying a respect that had been completely absent when the demonstration began. "Sir," Kian replied, his demeanor returning to the respectful deference he had always shown to authority, though something fundamental had changed in how that respect was received. "Who are you?" Beckett asked a question that everyone present wanted answered. Kian looked around the facility, taking in the faces of people who would never again see him as simply the man who cleaned their floors. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who finally stopped hiding from the truth. "I'm someone who learned that real strength isn't about winning," he said. "It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. Today I remembered why I walked away, and I remembered why sometimes you can't." As the crowd began to disperse, still talking in hushed tones about what they had witnessed, Dr. Alara Thorne approached Kian with an expression that mixed admiration with concern. "How do you feel?" she asked quietly. Kian looked at his hands, at the call-used knuckles that had just reminded 8 elite warriors that humility was a lesson that sometimes had to be taught rather than learned. "Like myself," he said. "For the first time in 3 years I feel like myself." The silence in the training facility was broken by a voice from the back of the assembled crowd. Commander Joanne Hayes, a veteran officer whose career had spanned multiple decades of military service, stepped forward with the slow, deliberate movements of someone whose memory had just connected dots that others had missed. "Kai Chen," she said, her voice carrying across the hushed facility like a stone dropped into still water. Every head turned toward her, then back to Kian, who stood motionless at the center of the mat. The name hung in the air with the weight of recognition that was spreading through the crowd like ripples expanding outward from a point of impact. "The silent storm," Commander Hayes continued, her voice gaining strength as certainty replaced suspicion. "Undefeated mixed martial arts champion. 47 wins, 0 losses. You disappeared 3 years ago at the height of your career. Admiral Beckett's expression shifted from post-demonstration analysis to sharp focus as the implications of this revelation began to register. Around the facility, murmurs of recognition grew as personnel pulled out phones to search for images and videos that would confirm what their commanding officer had just announced. "Is that true?" Beckett asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to receiving complete honesty from subordinates. Kian looked around the facility at faces that had transformed from curiosity to awe to something approaching disbelief. For 3 years, he had successfully maintained anonymity among people whose profession required them to notice details others missed. Now that carefully constructed invisibility was dissolving under the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what this admission would mean for the quiet life he had built with Sophia. The 8 Navy SEALs who had just been systematically defeated were processing this information with expressions that ranged from amazement to embarrassment to grudging respect. Gideon Stone, still slightly dazed from his encounter with unconsciousness, shook his head in disbelief. "We just got schooled by a legend," he muttered to Cameron Shaw, who was staring at Kian with the expression of someone re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about combat sports and military superiority. "The silent storm," Orion Reed repeated, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "My God, I watched your fights in college. You were unstoppable." Dr. Thorne stepped closer to Kian, her presence offering subtle support as he navigated the exposure he had spent 3 years avoiding. She understood better than anyone the cost of this revelation, not just to his privacy but to the carefully constructed stability he had created for his daughter. "Sir," Kian addressed Admiral Beckett directly, "I would appreciate if this information remained within appropriate channels. My daughter doesn't know about my former career, and I'd prefer to keep my personal life separate from today's demonstration." Beckett nodded slowly, his strategic mind already calculating the implications of having a world-class fighter working anonymously within his facility. "Understood, Mr. Chen. Or do you prefer Stone?" "Stone," Kian replied. "That life ended 3 years ago." Commander Hayes approached with the bearing of someone whose respect had been earned through witnessing something extraordinary. "May I ask why you walked away? You were at the absolute peak of the sport." The question that everyone wanted answered hung between them like a bridge that Kian could either cross or leave unbuilt. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of loss that had shaped every decision he had made since. "I lost everything that mattered more than winning," he said simply. "And I realized that all the championships in the world couldn't bring back what I'd failed to protect." The facility fell silent again as the assembled military personnel grappled with the concept of someone voluntarily abandoning the pinnacle of achievement in pursuit of something more valuable than glory. "Your family, Dr. Thorne said quietly, her words carrying understanding rather than inquiry. "My family," Kian confirmed. Admiral Beckett stepped forward, his expression carrying a respect that extended far beyond Kian's fighting achievements. "Mr. Stone, what you demonstrated today wasn't just technical skill. It was control, restraint and wisdom. Those qualities are rare in any arena but particularly in combat." "Thank you, sir. I'd like to make you an offer," Beckett continued. "Our combat instruction program could benefit enormously from someone with your background and philosophy. The position would come with appropriate rank and compensation." Kian considered the offer while aware that every person in the facility was waiting for his response. The opportunity represented everything he had walked away from: recognition, respect, and the chance to return to the world where his skills were valued and understood. "Admiral, I'm honored by the offer," he replied, "but I'm not the same person who won those championships. That man believed that fighting was the answer to everything. I've learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose not to fight at all." He paused, looking around at the faces of people who were seeing him clearly for the first time. "I'll continue working here, if you'll have me," he continued. But as Kian Stone, not Kai-chin. And when I go home tonight I'll still be nothing more than a father who loves his daughter and wants her to grow up believing that kindness is stronger than violence. As the crowd began to disperse with a new understanding of the man who had been invisible among them for 3 years, Admiral Beckett approached Kian one final time. "Stone," he said quietly, "you've taught my SEALs something today that they couldn't learn in any classroom or training scenario." "What's that, sir?" "That true strength isn't about it's about choosing what to fight for." 3 months later, the Iron Harbor Naval Training Center had settled into a new rhythm that acknowledged the presence of someone extraordinary who had chosen to remain ordinary. Kian Stone continued to arrive each morning at 5 a.m., continued to clean floors with the same methodical precision, and continued to maintain the spotless standards that had always characterized his work. But everything had changed. The SEALs who once barely noticed him now nodded with genuine respect. When he passed through the training facilities, they had learned to see past the mop and bucket to recognize someone whose understanding of transcended anything they had been taught in their elite training programs. More importantly, they had learned that humility was not choosing restraint required more courage than choosing violence. Gideon Stone approached Kian as he finished in the weight room, his massive frame carrying none of the casual arrogance that had once defined its interactions with support staff. "Kian," he said, using the first name that had become a mark of respect rather than familiarity. "Could I ask you something?" "Of course, that thing you did when you asked." Searching for words to describe an experience that had humbled him completely. "I've been submitted before, but I've never felt so completely outclassed. How do you learn to move like that?" Kian leaned against his mop handle, considering how to answer a question that touched on decades of dedicated training and hard-won wisdom. "You learned that fighting isn't about proving you're stronger someone else," he replied. "It's about understanding yourself well enough to know when strength is necessary, and when it's just ego looking for validation. And today, when you faced all of us, today was necessary," Kian said simply. "Sometimes people need to be reminded that respect isn't something you're entitled to because of what you wear, or what title you carry. It's something you earn through how you treat others." Dr. Elara Thorne appeared in the doorway of the weight room, her presence immediately brightened Kian's expression in a way that had become familiar to anyone who observed them together. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on the foundation of mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to care for people whose wounds weren't always visible. "Soviet school call," she said, addressing Kian directly. "She won the science fair with her project about leverage in physics. Apparently she's been telling everyone that taught her about how small forces can overcome large ones when applied correctly." Kian smiled, the expression transforming its features in a way that reminded everyone who saw it that beneath the legendary fighting father, simply a father who measured his success by his daughter's happiness. "She's been paying attention," he said. "She wants you to come to the award ceremony." Elara continued. "They're presenting her project to the whole school." "I'll be there," Kian replied without hesitation, his priorities clear and unwavering.
As Gideon watched this exchange, he understood something that no amount of military training could have taught him. True strength wasn't measured by how many opponents you could defeat, but by how many people you could protect, nurture, and inspire to become better than they thought possible. That evening, Kian sat in the small auditorium of Millfield Elementary School, watching his 8-year-old daughter explain the principles of leverage to an audience of parents and teachers who had no idea they were listening to concepts taught by one of the greatest fighters who had ever lived. When Sophia's presentation ended, and she received her blue ribbon, she ran directly to him with the pure joy of someone whose entire world was validated by her father's presence and approval. "Did I do good, Daddy?" she asked, her arms wrapped around his neck in a hug that reminded him daily why he had chosen love over legacy. "You did perfect, sweetheart," he replied, and meant it completely. Later, as they walked to the parking lot with Dr. Thorne beside them, Sophia skipping ahead with her ribbon clutched in her small hand, Elara placed her hand gently in Kian's. "She's going to grow up knowing that the strongest man she's ever met chose to be gentle," Elara said quietly. "That's going to shape how she sees the world." Kian squeezed her hand, understanding that some victories were measured not in championships or recognition, but in the quiet moments when love proved stronger than any force he had ever learned to apply in combat. "Good," he said, watching his daughter's happiness illuminate the evening darkness. "That's exactly what I want her to learn." As they drove home together, three people who had found in each other the kind of strength that couldn't be taught in any training facility, Kian realized that he had finally discovered what it meant to be truly undefeated. Not because he had never lost a fight, but because he had learned that the battles worth winning were the ones fought not for glory, but for love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.